Top of the morning to you and welcome to our special coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm Olumide Macaulay. The headlines. Russia launches moon lander in race to find water on the moon. Russia strikes Zaporizhzhia hotel used as main base for humanitarian organizations. Plus, Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba says Saudi talks were a breakthrough. Thank you for joining us. We begin with news coming out of the Russian capital, Moscow. We're learning that the country has launched its first moon landing spacecraft in 47 years in a bid to be the first power to make a soft landing on the lunar South Pole, a region believed to hold coveted deposits of water ice. The Soyuz 2.15 rocket carrying the Lunar 25 craft blasted off from the Cosmodrome 3,450 miles east of Moscow. According to Russia's space agency, the lander is due to touch down on the moon on August the 23rd. The Russian lunar mission, the first since 1976, is racing against India, which sent up its lunar lander last month, and more broadly with the United States and China, which both have advanced lunar exploration programs. To the battlefield, Russian forces repelled Ukrainian attacks in multiple directions and advanced combat in the direction of Kupiansk, while Ukrainian troops continued offensives in the direction of Bakhmut. The Russian Defense Ministry said in its daily report that Russian forces foiled rounds of Ukrainian offensives in directions of Donetsk, South Donetsk and Zaporizhzhia, adding that the Russian army improved the position along the front line in the Kupiansk direction. On the other hand, the spokesman for Ukraine's Eastern Military Command, Serhiy Sherevati, says Ukrainian forces continued their offensive actions in the direction of Bakhmut, even as Russia tried to break the Ukrainian army defense in the Kupiansk direction. The UN humanitarian coordinator for Ukraine, Denise Brown, said she was appalled by Russia's attack on a hotel in Zaporizhzhia that was used as a main base for UN staff and members of other humanitarian organizations. Brown said she and her colleagues had stayed at said hotel during their previous visits to the region. It served as the UN base for operation to evacuate civilians from the Azovstal plant in Mariupol last year. She called on Russia to comply with their obligations under international humanitarian law and immediately stop indiscriminate attacks on Ukraine. Ukraine's defense ministry says the hotel was also the site of a children's day camp that finished its daily operations about an hour before Russia's attack. One person was reported killed in that attack. Meanwhile, in Ukraine's southeastern Zaporizhzhia region, the frontline town of Orikhiv has seen some of the fiercest fighting of recent weeks since Ukraine launched a counter-offensive in early June. Charred walls of what used to be high-rise residential buildings were seen across the now abandoned town. Sounds of explosions shake the ghost town, and local police chief is under Russian shelling every day, according to him, the region that is. Similarly, Ukrainian officials reported a recent increase in the amount of Russian shelling in the Zaporizhzhia region. Two Russian Tu-160 strategic bombers performed an 8-hour scheduled flight over the neutral waters of the Barents Sea and the Arctic Ocean. According to footage released by Russia's defense ministry, the nuclear-capable supersonic aircraft, nicknamed White Swans by Russian flyers and given the NATO reporting name Blackjacks, were escorted by Su-35C fighter jets. Russian military officials say the fight was undertaken in accordance with international regulations. The defense ministry says Russian strategic aircraft routinely perform similar flights over the waters of the Arctic, Northern Atlantic, Black and Baltic Seas, as well as the Pacific Ocean. Ukraine's former minister Dmytro Kuleba says a summit in Saudi Arabia last week, attended by more than 40 countries, is a breakthrough that shows coalition building is possible to support a 10-point plan proposed by President Vladimir Zelensky. Speaking in an interview, Mr. Kuleba says the number of countries interested in participating in such meetings has increased dramatically in recent months, and that the events lay a crucial foundation for future talks on Ukraine's vision for peace.
I believe the meeting in Jeddah was a breakthrough, because for the first time we brought together countries representing entire world, not only Europe and North America, but entire world. Asia was present with India and China sitting at the table. Africa was present. South America was present. So, also it is important to note that between the first meeting of this coordination group in Copenhagen a month ago and the meeting in Jeddah, the number of countries willing to participate has increased dramatically. So basically the dynamics is very positive. And, if I would put it this way, if a country wants to be in the front seat of world politics, it has to become part of these coordination meetings. Now, two countries who have weapons of this kind are Germany and the United States. We are in talks with both, and it was the subject, for example, it was one of the subjects of my conversation with Secretary of State Antony Blinken just on last Friday. And the good news is that, unlike with all previous cases, our conversations with partners on new weapons started with a no. A no that would end up as yes. This time there is no no. They are open to discuss it. They are in the process of making their own calculations and analysis. And these options, I think they will be unlocked.
Meanwhile, Mr. Kuleba is confident that Ukraine's dispute with Poland over grain can be resolved, and told Polish farmers that their common enemy was Russian President Vladimir Putin. The EU in May allowed Bulgaria, Hungary, Poland, Romania and Slovakia to ban domestic sale of Ukrainian wheat, maize, rapeseed and sunflower seeds, while permitting transit of such cargoes for export elsewhere. The ban is set to end on September the 15th.
We are grateful for what Poland has done for Ukraine and Ukrainians since the beginning of the aggression. This gratefulness is unquestionable. We completely disagree with the policy line Poland has taken on the issue of grain. We believe that grain should be out of politics. It should remain purely humanitarian issue. And I'm confident we will find a way out with our Polish friends, and relationship will not mess up entirely, because this relationship is much broader and deeper. But yes, as of now, we are in a very difficult moment with Poland on the issue of grain. And the D-Day is, the key day will be 15th of September, when the European Commission is expected not to extend its restrictions. And then everything will depend on unilateral actions taken by Poland. And we hope that they will not take them. We are working with them. Ukrainian farmer is definitely not your enemy. It's a friend who works as hard as you do. Our common enemy is Russia, and the only country that celebrates any slightest discussion, argument between Ukrainians and Poles, it's President Putin. Let's not make him happy.
Let's talk now to Victoria Sarida, Senior Fellow, Forum of Transregional Studies, and also Senior Researcher, National Academy of Science, Ukraine, joining us from Berlin in Germany. Privit, good morning. Welcome to the program.
Privit, dobro ranku. Morning.
Dobro ranku. I'm trying to get past the pleasantries in learning Ukraine, but there's no one to speak it with here, except a computer.
So we can try to set up a separate line.
Okay, fantastic. Now, we've heard from the Ukraine Foreign Minister, Dmytro Kuleba, who says and admits that Ukraine is in a difficult situation with Poland concerning the grain supply. And how, in your view, can the interests of Polish farmers be protected while at the same time granting that corridor for the evacuation of Ukrainian goods such as grain so that both sides will be happy?
So we know it's a very long story of battle of Polish farmers with EU policies. It's not only a recent or current situation for their rights and for their possibilities. And especially with elections upcoming in Poland, these discussions also rise because these are extremely important issues for Polish farmers. And Ukraine is trying its talks both using EU leverages and also within the Poland, because Ukraine and Poland are neighbors and have a long history, and trying different political and economic channels to ask for a possibility to ship grain. And one of the arguments is that if grain stays on the territory of Ukraine, we just 2 weeks ago see that it was hit by Russian missiles heavily. So Ukraine is afraid that this grain, which can be shipped outside of the country, will be just simply lost and burned by missiles.
The farmers in Russia are operating under the very harsh and stringent and scary conditions of an active war. How much would you know of how they are determined to continue to farm and harvest these goods that are taken to the ports of departure, whether by land or not as much by sea now, as this war continues?
Ukrainian government is trying very hard as well. So Ukrainian government offered a deal with Ukrainian farmers as well. They offered coverage and insurance quite high to repay if anything happens. But of course, this is the matter and question of people's lives, and we are talking right now that Ukraine has absolutely highest number of mines in the world in its lands, and demining will take ages, not a year or two or many years. And we had many stories when people were trying to harvest or were trying to plant something, and they lost their lives in those fields. So this is not only a case of economic support, but also issue of everyday life and lives of farmers and their
Imagine
families.
as a farmer having to go to your fields and being worried about being blown up by mines. That's a very, very disturbing proposition. The last time we spoke, Professor, the situation at the Poland-Belarus border was simmering with the dispersal of the Wagner mercenary groups to Belarus. Now, as recently as yesterday or the day before, I believe, 10,000 Polish troops have been deployed to the border to help with the border guards because of the presence of the Wagner mercenary group. Now, are the polls making too much of this matter? And will a presence of more soldiers at the border do more harm than good?
We also hear it here from beginning from yesterday that also Lithuania is asking for more US troops to be stationed on its border. So both countries are really trying to press hard and station as much troops as possible on their borders. Of course, we know that both countries are part of the NATO, so the fifth paragraph is still will be protecting them. But we also know that Wagner Group is a private military unit. So it's a question that it has different types of operation under false flags all across the globe, including your continent, including Africa, we know. So they are worried that they will be not launching real offense, but do some operations which will be in a hybrid form. And for this reason, they are trying to protect their border.
Do you personally believe that the Wagner mercenary groups will do anything as foolhardy as provoking Poland when they know that this obviously will turn the situation into one that that cannot be handled by all parties concerned, because it will definitely cause an escalation to the conflict if, for instance, there's any sort of conflict at the Polish-Belarus border?
I don't think that they will try to do it openly, but we already saw, for example, a week ago when two military aircraft crossed for very short periods of time Polish border. These were Belarusian, they were not hit, there were warnings and there were discussions. So I think this is more to keep up discourses or talks in media, and to try to push or have an additional leverage on EU, showing that there are possibilities, there could be escalation. So let's start peace talks before we have escalations on the territory of Belarus or on the territory close to Polish or Lithuanian borders. But I do not think that they will launch any full-scale operation or something. And in addition to that, this creates a situation when Ukraine has to keep part of its military on Ukrainian-Belarusian border in the case they will launch some operations from the north of the country. So I think these are different goals they are aiming with their operations within the Belarus.
The developments concerning the success that Ukraine has recorded in sabotaging some ships at the ports on the sea, the Black Sea, for which now President Volodymyr Zelensky says that they will do what they will try to secure some sort of advantage over Russia in the Black Sea. What was your impression of this particular development? Is Ukraine going to, and they've had some success, they've used underwater drones, they've damaged the hull of some ships, and it seems to me that they're also now beginning to look at naval maritime targets of the Russians.
Yes, because Russia stepped out of grain deal, which was extremely important and was negotiated by UN, and then it started to hit Ukrainian infrastructure, both military and on Ukraine's mainland, connected to the grain deal, blowing up both infrastructure and grain itself. And it declared that now it will use its vessels to ship the grain. And then Ukraine tried to counterbalance the situation, saying that we also can hit different types of ships and vessels in Black Sea. So we do have to negotiate and renegotiate the grain deal. And as far as I know, President of Turkey, Erdogan, already announced a new round of possible talks about the new grain deal or continuation of grain deal between Ukraine, Russia, and UN.
Should President Zelensky be looking more at that you've just mentioned, the continuation of the grain deal? Because it's quite obvious that Ukraine doesn't have that much naval power to take the battle to Russia on the Black Sea. Is it too risky, you think, or it's just something that is part of will be part of a credible battle plan for Ukraine to actually begin to engage the Russians on the Black Sea?
I think it's both. It's still keeping up and being part of negotiated processes. And this is one of the few successes which were reached concerning the Ukraine's participation. So this is important one, and it's important globally. As soon as the grain deal was withheld, we immediately saw how the prices for food jumped again, and I think this is very important globally. And on the other hand, Ukraine is trying to show that now Ukraine can reach different types of vessels within the Black Sea. And we are looking at forward to situation with Crimea and attempts of Ukrainian military to isolate as much as possible the supplies, the military supplies into peninsula.
At the top of the program today, we reported the attack of the Russians on a hotel in Zaporizhia and reports of offensives that seem to be going ahead as planned by the Ukrainians, some repelled by the Russians. What's your current estimation of a true reflection of how the war stands as at today, over 5 days into this conflict?
I'm not a military expert, so it's very difficult to say from the military point of view. I'm rather a sociologist. So we do observe that gains were very limited on Ukrainian side, and we already heard a lot of explanations why. First of all, because the time with supplies of different types of weapons was lost. And also Russia had enough time to build a triple defense system. But what we also observe that Ukrainian society is very much supporting the regaining of all territories. All recent polls show that Ukrainians are not ready to give up on their territories, especially when we see more and more news about the atrocities happening on those territories and the situation with kids, which we discussed previously. So the spirit in the country still for offense, even if it will take much longer than we expected, and probably it will prolong the next year because in a few months we'll have rains which will stop heavy vehicles from the progress, and then winter comes. So probably the war will continue through this year and the next year, and people are aware in our country. But they are also grateful to Ukrainian commanders that they are not forcing soldiers for advance just in the sake of advance, that they are quite carefully advancing and trying to save as much lives as possible.
You know what they say, Professor, so much to do, so little time. We're going to have to let you go, but many thanks, Diakuyu, for your contribution and your insight this morning.
I'm honored to be with you this morning. Thank you.
Professor Victoria Sarida, Senior Fellow, Forum of Transregional Studies and the Senior Researcher, National Academy of Science in Ukraine. After the break, Kremlin Aid publishes 4 history textbooks for 16 to 18-year-old school children. Details in a moment. Please stay with us. Welcome back. We are officially in the sophomore stretch, second half of today's coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine. Now, the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz has pledged continued military support to Ukraine, but noted his government will act responsibly to avoid a confrontation between NATO and Russia. Mr. Scholz says, "We always pay attention that the decisions we take will not escalate this into a war between Russia and NATO. Ukraine is attacked by Russia. Ukraine is defending itself, and it will be supported by us." The Social Democrat politician made the remarks during a citizen dialogue meeting in the eastern city of Erfurt, where he addressed questions from participants. United States President Joe Biden says he was sending Congress a request for about $40 billion in additional spending, including $24 billion for Ukraine and other international needs related to the war. White House Budget Director Shalanda Young, in a letter to House Speaker Kevin McCarthy, urged swift action to follow through on the U.S. commitment to the Ukrainian people's defense of their homeland and to democracy around the world, as well as other needs. Mr. Biden and his senior national security team have repeatedly said the United States will help Ukraine as long as it takes to remove Russia from within its borders. The Ukrainian Navy has announced temporary corridors for civilian shipping in the Black Sea following the suspension of the grain initiative. Russia withdrew from the arrangement last month. The Ukrainian Navy issued an order declaring temporary corridors for merchant ships sailing to and from Ukrainian ports. Currently, merchant ships are not traveling to and from the Ukrainian port of Odessa or neighboring harbors, crippling the export of grain from those ports. The last ship with grain on board left Odessa on July the 16th. The Ukrainian Navy said the routes it had announced will primarily be used to allow civilian vessels that have been in the Ukrainian ports of Odessa and Yuzhny since the beginning of Russia's full-scale invasion on February the 24th, 2022, to leave. Kremlin aide Vladimir Medinsky has published 4 history textbooks for 16 to 18-year-old school children, giving a completely revised interpretation of the fall of the Soviet Union. Now, the Putin era and the causes of Russia's ongoing military action in Ukraine as well in those books. The books, which enter schools next month, reflects President Putin's historical view, pride at the achievements of the superpower Soviet Union, indignation at the humiliation of the Soviet collapse, and a claim for the rebirth of Russia under the former KGB spy rule, which began on the last day of 1999. The final chapter of the 447-page history of Russia, 1945 to the start of the 21st century, focuses on the causes of the biggest land war in Europe since World War II, the Ukraine conflict that has left several 100,000 soldiers injured or dead, and which Moscow casts as a special military operation. Russia currently controls a little under 1/5 of Ukraine, which has sought to rewrite its own history and purge much of its Soviet and Tsarist past. Now let's talk to Mr. Kumi Akande, Secretary, the Soyuznik Alumni Association, Nigeria, Lagos State Branch. Is also an alumni Association of Nigerian Graduates of Higher Institutions in countries of former Soviet Union. That includes Russia, Ukraine, Latvia, Estonia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, and Georgia. He's also spent about 28 years in Russia. Welcome to the program, and thank you for joining us.
It is my pleasure. Good to be back in your studio.
It's good to have you. And your resume, as it were, is perfect for the question that I'm going to begin with, which is the rewriting of history, as it were, by President Putin. And on both sides, the last thing I said was that Ukraine is trying to erase its ties to its Tsarist and Soviet Union past. And nothing is more symbolic of that than the removal of the trident from the famous statue, from the Soviet emblem from the famous statue in Ukraine, and replacing it with a Ukrainian tridents. That's equivalent of taking the Statue of Liberty donated to America by the French and removing the lamp and putting something else on it. So, and it's also very sad, I dare say. Well, what is your impression of these issues as it stands, with both sides trying to emasculate themselves of their ties to their past?
Yeah, I mean, further to my position during my last appearance on this program about a year ago, that the conflict is actually a disaster by any stretch of imagination, up to the point of an attempt to rewrite history. Actually, rewriting history is not an easy task because you can't erase people's memory. It's like where there is a divorce, you can't rewrite the fact that you are actually at the registry at the stage, even if you tear the marriage certificate, but the pictures will still linger and it will still be in people's memory. So whatever is coming out of this conflict is a consequence of disagreement. So I don't think all those facts can be obliterated in the minds of many people that have witnessed those history on both sides.
Is there any hope that there will be any sort of reconciliation by both parties, given their historical and filial antecedents?
Well, like I've said, they are actually like twin brothers. So when there are conflict within brothers, it does not sever your blood relations. But you can always disagree on issues. So the disagreement will subsist, and is actually an historical disagreement since the days of Soviet Union, but which were really downplayed because, I mean, there was a better understanding and collaborative effort within the context of Soviet Union. So every other disagreement now is just trying to magnify the little difference between between Russia and Ukraine, because they are just one and the same people. Because when you look at their history, I mean, there's never been a country like Ukraine. You have Kievsky rules, which, I mean, is kind of several nationalities. It's just like we're talking about Nigeria. Then we're now saying, okay, we have never been related before. We have never had anything to do. When we have intermarried, most Russians are married to Ukrainians. Many Ukrainians are married to Russians.
Now, it's quite worrisome because President Putin has been criticized by the West in this matter, obviously, and labeled this war being labeled as Putin's war. But there's a groundswell of reportage and opinions and analysis from around the West that President Putin is this dictator with the iron fist that is driving his people to the precipice of disaster because of this war. But he's the same person that, by and large, has received the support of the Russian people because he ushered Russia from the 1990s through the 2000s, late 1990s to the 2000s, up to now to a period of prosperity and stability in their economy and with their military, as far as it has been disclosed. How much of the support that Putin enjoys is being eroded or possibly being consolidated by this war?
Well, anyone that is familiar with the Cold War era, I've always understood something. The West believes Russia wants to eliminate it, and Russia believes the West will never work for its interests. So coming with that psyche, everybody will stand with their country. So the Russians will be with their president. Americans will be with their president. When the West is fighting in Afghanistan, the American people were with their president. Nobody was asking questions. What's our business in Afghanistan? And we're talking about strategic interests. Russia's interest, sphere of influence, includes Ukraine, just as American sphere of influence includes NATO countries. So we cannot be denied those facts. And we have to live with those facts. That the West is describing Putin this way. The Russians are describing the West the other way as well. Both sides are right.
If both sides are right, then who is wrong? And how can this war be brought to some sort of a ceasefire to even begin with? The Saudi Arabia conference has been touted by Ukraine and some other countries as being a success. But if you are going to measure success by any sort of concessions or mediations between Russia and Ukraine, then it hasn't been a success because Russia isn't even at the table. But they say it's, the argument for that is that they say it's the foundation for possible future peace talks and what have you. What's your view of the Saudi peace conference?
I think one has to commend that because, I mean, there is a gradual shift of ground. Because if China, few of the allies of Russia, actually are supporting such peace initiative, I think it's quite commendable. Because at the beginning of the conflict, there has always been peace effort, but it has always failed. And we only pray this will not fail because of the impact of the conflict, not just on Russia, not just on Ukraine, but on the whole world. Europe is bleeding. The economy is in bad shape.
Right, but see, now China has positioned itself in such a way as to try to appear to be neutral. So the fact that they were at that conference, does that mean that they now are leaning towards Ukraine, or is just further posturing from China to display their own current position as a world power with significant influence with both sides?
Well, you know, like the international relations, it always has several dimensions. The Chinese interest, I mean, is quite diverse as well. You have the Taiwan issue to consider, and there is this belief after Ukraine, next American project is Taiwan. So definitely everybody is just trying to find a convenient position whereby they can maximally project their interests. So basically, China is doing the right thing because Saudi actually has aligned with the Russians as well at a stage on OPEC front, thereabouts. And there seems to be some sympathy in the Middle East. But at the end of the day, reasons, cause that the war cannot continue till eternity. People must be shifting ground. Then people must be aligning towards a peaceful resolution. Because everybody knows it's a proxy war. It's not just an war wanted by Ukraine. The vested interests are too many. But the grass is suffering, which is, Ukraine is the battleground, which is a disaster.
Now let's talk about subterfuge, espionage, and some cases that have been reported recently, including that of a Ukrainian man, I believe in Germany, arrested for attempting to spy for the Russians. Also, some other Ukrainian individuals, including a woman who was accused of being part of some sort of plan to assassinate President Zelensky in the past week. Could you speak to the point that there are elements in Ukraine who are pro-Russian and elements in Russia who are pro-Ukraine or sympathetic to both sides?
Oh yeah, that's actually expected, because there are a lot of Russians that actually have lived all their lives in Ukraine. There are a lot of Ukrainians that have lived all their lives in Russia. Their family is in Russia. They see themselves as Russians, but their origin is Ukraine. And on the other side, a lot of interest has actually merged together. When you are looking at accusation, counter-accusation, you know, in war, the war front includes the media, includes propaganda. And sometimes you don't even know who is saying the truth.
Right. So we hope that this conflict comes to an end. Finally, Mr. Akinade, there's so many casualties, over 10,000 civilians at the last count by the Ukrainians killed, so much cross-border migration, and you could call displacement of Ukrainians who've left their motherland to find safety in other realms.
Yeah.
What would you like to see as a demonstration of good faith on both sides at the negotiating table for this war to come to some sort of semblance of an end?
Like you rightly noted, it's quite a catastrophe. 6.3 million Ukrainians are now refugees across the world. Most of them ran to Russia. Incidentally, most of them are in Russia. So they are part of Russia's body now. So at the end of the day, the war doesn't favor Russia, nor does it favor Ukraine. That's the sad side of it. So the only thing that favors both sides is peace. But clearly the forces that doesn't want peace, except perhaps certain objective is achieved, are actually outside Russia and Ukraine. So if those third-party elements actually can agree that this war must stop, I know definitely it will stop. So perhaps that's why we should commend the Saudi initiative. I think that's kind of a step in the right direction. However, I also need to point to this, perhaps a dimension that we should actually be more bothered about, and perhaps which may throw a better and bigger picture perspective into this conflict. It's more about the bipolar war. It's a resurrection of the Cold War, but it's coming back in a very, very volatile form. During the Cold War, there was a kind of balance. Everybody was talking about peace, peace, peace everywhere. But if we look at what we're having now, everybody is talking about war. And there's conflict everywhere. Nobody is talking about peace. Everybody wants to achieve their end. A party is struggling for a unipolar war. Others are fighting for a multipolar war. That it can't be a unipolar war, or at best a bipolar war that has given some kind of peace. And there couldn't be progress or development in an atmosphere of war. And the dangerous side of this war is already in Africa.
The ascendancy of Russia after the Cold War speaks to their resilience, but now maybe a decline after this. But we hope at the end of the day, whatever posturing that the world powers adopt, that peace will be given a chance. Thank you so much, Mr. Kumi Akinade, Secretary, Soyuznik, Alumni Association of Nigeria, for being with us on the program this morning.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
When we return, Poland plans to send up to 10,000 soldiers to border with Belarus. Details in a moment. Please stay with us. Welcome to the final stretch of today's coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine. Residents in central Moscow say they were worried by the drop in the Russian ruble exchange rate to the dollar but did not feel any drastic immediate effect as a result of it. On Wednesday, the ruble had sunk to 98.0725, its weakest point against the dollar since March 25th, 2022, hampered by strong foreign currency demand and limited supply. The Bank of Russia this week said it will stop conducting the finance ministry's foreign exchange purchases as described by Russia's budget rule from Thursday in order to reduce market volatility. The ruble had strengthened in early trade on Thursday, but it was 0.4% weaker against the dollar at 97.57. And finally on the program, Poland is planning to move up to 10,000 additional troops to the border with Belarus to support the border guard. Speaking in an interview, Defense Minister says 4,000 soldiers will directly support the border guard and 6,000 will be in reserve. Poland is worried increasingly about the border area since hundreds of battle-hardened Wagner mercenaries arrived in Belarus last month at the invitation of President Alexander Lukashenko. More than 22,000 soldiers and hundreds of tanks, fighter jets and other military vehicles will parade through Warsaw on Armed Forces Day, celebrated annually on August the 15th to commemorate Poland's victory over the Soviet Union's Red Army in 1920. And this is where we call it a day for this edition of Russian invasion of Ukraine. Thank you for watching. I'm Olumide Macaulay. Many thanks to our guests, our producers, and you, our viewers, for being with us. Do join us again, top of the week on Monday for a fresh edition. I'm Olumide Macaulay. Have a good weekend.